Alright, I'm recording now. Great. So this is going to be a brief introductory demo on creature design. Oh, we lost Sean. um, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the three kind of main things that I think are kind of important for creature design, and I would just be kind of lecturing for a little bit here to kind of introduce some topics I think are important. And then after that, I'll be taking questions and doing a demo. But while I'm talking, feel free to interrupt me to ask a question if you don't understand something or if you want me to repeat anything. So the first point I'm going to bring up here is structure and recognizability. Now, these are two separate subjects, but I think they're pretty interlinked. For any creature that you're designing based on any real-world animal, there's obviously certain traits that are going to help us define what that thing is, or what it roughly looks like, right? Something can't be an octopus with only 2 legs. That doesn't really work. It's not going to look like an octopus. And similarly, the example we have here, these are a few different canines. Now, I think if you looked at any of these shape languages or silhouettes, you can tell pretty well, at least for the right 3, that this is a dog kind of thing, a canine sort of creature. The one on the left's a little wacky, and we'll get to why it looks wacky in a second. But the main thing here to note is that even if you're working with just a dog, quote-unquote, creature, there's a lot of variety you can get from dogs. Dog breeds have a lot of very different shapes, and I think, honestly, out of all of these, if I look at the shapes, the one on the right most, this kind of generic lab, golden lab here, really reads as a dog. I think immediately. The shapes are friendly, they're rounded, they're cute, they have big feet, big ribcage, big head, thick snout. Right? They have this kind of friendly sort of dog look to them. As you move towards things like German Shepherds, you get a little bit more of a wolf kind of shape, so we can tell this is still a dog, but the shapes are a little bit more pointy, right? That ribcage is a bit more narrow. The pelvis is actually tilted now, it's not even with the ground. So you'll notice that the lab, its pelvis, its ribcage are even with the ground, they're parallel. That means the dog has a kind of natural standing position. And it's very neutral. It doesn't have a very aggressive stance, right? This dog is comfortable to kind of stand around, wait on things. Not really built for running necessarily. It's a companion dog. Whereas if we look at this German Shepherd, they're built for chasing. They're built for aggressive sort of behaviors, right? They've been bred for it, and their pelvis is always tilted, which not only leads to spinal problems for this breed, but also, generally speaking, makes it easier for the dog to chase things down holes or through narrow sort of gaps in the forest, for example, if you're bringing it hunting. So the dog has a little bit more of an aggressive stance, right? That rib cage is tilted a little bit. The pelvis is quite tilted at this point, and you can tell the dog is a little bit more aggressive, right? It has pointier features, narrower snout, narrow ears, and it has this kind of forward momentum to its body, right? We kind of have this movement going this way. Versus I think on this lab, it's a pretty nice, even kind of neutral stance. And now when we get to something like a whippet, which is another word for a greyhound, which is a breed of racing dog, you can really see how wacky these proportions are. These are crazy, right? This rib cage is super contorted. I mean, if we look at the proportion of that kind of central mass here, just compared to the golden retriever, golden lab, you can see there's a really big difference in terms of how much space that's taking up, and also the momentum of where it's going. It's really tilting, and so is this pelvis. I mean, this pelvis is even more tilted than that German Shepherd, right? This dog is built to run. It is not built to do anything else. It's been bred to do simply one task and move forward. This body has a lot of forward momentum. It has that narrow neck, that narrow snout, the narrow legs. It's pushing forward way more than this guy, who's just kind of standing. This one's pushing a little, but this one's really out there, right? And then we last have something like a maned wolf. Now these are very strange looking creatures. They have very, very oddly long limbs, and they have a really unusual natural gait that's bringing them forward in a different way from the whippet. The whippet looks fast. I don't know if this thing quite looks fast per se, but it doesn't look like it's meant to just stand around. It looks pretty aggressive, and it doesn't really look like a dog. I mean, if we took away the head, and I showed you this body, I don't know if you'd be able to tell this is a dog. uh, or that it's a canine in general. And so, if we're talking about a creature that's meant to resemble a canine or a dog, out of these four references you could pick from in real life, I don't think these two on the left here are great options. I mean, we can tell they're a dog vaguely with all of these extra details like the fur pattern, the feet, the cute dog face. I think we can tell they're canines, but when we look at just their proportions and their structure, they don't really read as friendly dogs. They read more so as things that look like dogs versus being actual dogs. I think these two are a safer choice. And, you know, these all have a very different energy to them as well, just in terms of not only their gesture and body proportions and how that forces their gesture to look, but also in terms of how narrowed, pointed the features are, how stocky or big they are. For example, the size of the feet changes drastically, right? They get smaller as you go across, right? You guys have seen puppies before, and puppies have very big feet when they're born, and it's very, very cute. And you can see comparatively, this dog has very stubby legs versus these over here. I mean, that's a massive difference in size and scale. And so the first kind of point to creature design when you're borrowing from real life and from examination from real things is to mark these kinds of differences and really understand them so that when you're going into design, you can actually apply those things and really understand what you're trying to say with the design. Even if it's just how large or rounded the ribcage is, that makes quite a bit of a difference in terms of the silhouette and movement and structure of the creature. So, that all being said, we kind of want to move from this kind of basic step, which I think is about proportion and recognizability of the creature, along with some structure, right? You need to know proportion and anatomy to kind of, at least a bit of anatomy to roughly get this stuff out of the way, to understand it. And I don't really want to give an anatomy seminar because this is more about design. So if you ever have doubts about the anatomy of something, I honestly suggest, if you're designing, say, a cow creature, go look up some cow anatomy and actually just sit with it for a few minutes and try to understand roughly what's going on. Because the more kind of base knowledge you have about any animal, the more that's going to apply to other animals in my experience personally. Especially with quadrupeds, which tend to be very, very similar structurally, even if they're quite different. But we'll get into some of the differences later on in terms of the functionality of the creatures. So outside of just the looks of how the creature is and the overall kind of structure and gesture of them, we got to move into function. Now, function is something that is kind of a general word, and I use the word a lot when I'm talking about design philosophy. But essentially, there's two kind of aspects to function that you need to worry about, in my opinion. One is the demand, right? The demand has to do with what you're being asked to do for the design. Does the creature in this case need to be able to pick up a sword? Does the creature need to be able to run on all fours? Does it need to be able to swim? Does it need to be able to fly? Right? How is it going to do those things is the next step you're going to go into. But the first part of functionality is what the demand is. So the demand is going to define a lot about your design, right? If it needs to be able to hold a sword, it can't have hooves for all of its feet. And if it does, they're going to need to be some pretty freaky hooves, or they're going to need to be very cartoony and have an unusual functionality to them. Which, when you get into more stylized stuff, this kind of demand can become the answers you have to the question of how do they actually do the thing they told me it needs to do. Right, your answer for how does it pick up that sword can be a lot more creative when you get more stylized, because you can break the rules of reality and how things actually work a little bit to help yourself out. But generally speaking, demand and what the requirements, you could also read this as requirements, of your design are, that's going to really define a lot of how you approach your creature. And also there's the second part of functionality, which is reality. This is more so why this kind of knowing anatomy and stuff and looking at things like bones and skeletons here is gonna help you out quite a bit. I think, for example, these sketches that I did down here, they're very, very rough and very fast. These are actual examples from project folders that I have on my computer that I did before starting a creature design. Because all I would do, in the case of, say, this, this water buffalo over here, I would look at this picture and I would say, all right, I kind of know how the quadruped is structured, and I would say, well, I'm not sure about some of this anatomy up here, right? Like this is a very smooth looking creature. I can't really see a lot of bony landmarks super easily. So I got an extreme version. This is going to come up a lot if you're working with creatures or references that are very difficult to understand, or you don't have a lot of good resources on. For example, I don't think there's a lot of in-depth breakdowns for anatomy on water buffaloes, just kind of floating around the internet. That's just not a thing you're going to really see or experience. But you will see a lot of cows and a lot of bulls. And cows and bulls are very, very similar to water buffaloes. So knowing a little bit about animals and knowing a little bit about the differences between different animals and the similarities, more importantly in this case, will help you out tremendously. So you can kind of just check out, look how visible these muscles are on this super high testosterone bull. Very easy to see. And in particular, some of the anatomical bony landmarks are very, very easy to see here and where they connect. And so based on this one, I did a rough sketch that marks some of the anatomical notes from this creature into a summarizing system that I tend to use. Now, this is not necessarily like the best or only way to summarize anatomy, but it is, generally speaking, a pretty useful one in my experience, which is thinking about it in terms of pivots. Now, pivots, if you're not sure what that means, are pivot points. They're points around which something will rotate. Now, when you look at a skeleton, the reason why we look at a skeleton at all is because it will show these pivot points, which are the joints. These joints are present in multiple places in the body. There's a lot of joints all along the spine here, right? Lots and lots and lots of those. And the reason this matters is because the pivot points are going to define function, right? How does this skeleton function? How can it function? How can it move? How can it do the things it needs to do? That's going to be related to where your joints are and how they're attached to each other. It's also going to relate to if the joints or the pivots are fixed or mobile. Now, if they're fixed, like say the pelvic joint here on this deer, it is fixed, right? That's a ball and socket joint. And if we go look at the reference, it's a ball and socket joint. The bone is not going to leave that joint, no matter what you do. And that bone can move around while it's in the joint, but it's going to start bumping into itself, into its own muscle tissue, into its own supports really quickly. It doesn't have a huge range of movement, but it has enough. And that pivot point can't really move, right? Like the pelvis is always going to be just this one hard fused bone. It's not going to be able to kind of wiggle one side and not wiggle the other. They're going to have to move as a whole unit, right? So these pivot points are kind of fixed. But there are mobile joints too. And that's where you're going to see things like scapula, right here, come into effect. The scapula, unlike the pelvis, slide across the rib cage. Right? We have a rib cage, and we can go across it and follow this circular path. Not necessarily all the way around, because things like the spinal column and things like limitations of musculature and other general physics stop you from rotating all around the rib cage. But this scapula joint can go multiple places, right? It can move. This pivot point itself is mobile, which means we have a lot more movement we can play with and engage with in joints like this on any creature design. But this comes with a bit of sacrifice, right? You'll notice that the pelvis on a lot of these creatures can be kind of small, kind of out of the way, and that's pretty useful because you can pack a lot of muscle onto that, but you're going to sacrifice some mobility, and that's fine. If you're not sacrificing mobility, if you're getting a lot of movement out of it, such as the case in the scapula, and that kind of joint, a sliding joint, you're going to start to see a lot of musculature support that needs to be put into effect. And you're also going to need to see a lot of space made for this. A huge support structure needs to be made for scapula to be able to slide around and be attached to the right muscles that push it the right places. It also needs to be able to bear weight, impact, lots of other things. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in a joint like this, so the structure needs to be pretty massive to support this specific type of functionality of it being more mobile, more fluid, and more able to rotate around. And so if we're looking at a lot of quadrupeds, you're going to see this pattern come up a lot, where the front is going to have a little bit more of this sacrifice made in terms of space real estate to get some more mobility in the front, so the creature can control what direction it's going in a bit better. And the back is going to sacrifice that mobility and flexibility to kind of get some more strong structural support, where the creature's joint is less weak and prone to being damaged. And you can also pack a lot more muscle on here, right? There's a lot less space being taken up by ligaments and other sliding things to move around, which is why a lot of creatures have like a really big haunch, which is the fun, nice word for saying its butt is kind of big, because that's where a lot of the power from it running forward is going to come from, that momentum. So you'll also notice on a lot of these creatures, I've kind of done a rough drawing to show what the outside of it looks like. You'll see this huge front area, whereas a lot of the muscle on the back here is kind of limited to like one side of where the pelvis is, and there's all this free room in between. This area needs to be massive, right? So that's the support structure I was talking about before, right? It needs to be pretty big, even on something like a deer, or a cat. On birds, it's absolutely huge, because birds have a very strong need to make their wings very powerful, so that entire structure is completely overhauled on a bird. But that's kind of the sort of next section I'll get into, but that's sort of summarizing what I mean about pivot. And that sense of functionality, right? Things need to be able to function, they need to be able to move. So there is that sense of not only the demand of your design, what they want your creature to do, but also what you've drawn it to be able to do. If you draw a deer that has these cute little hooves and he has these scapula, I think you're going to have a hard time convincing me that this deer's front legs can kick really, really hard and also can move with any strength in certain directions. Like, I think once it's past this pivot point here, visually it doesn't really make any sense. The scapula's all the way back here. It can't really rotate farther, right? The scapula can't push any farther. If this leg can't really go up here. This looks like the scapula is going to be coming out of the body, right? This gets crazy. That's not how a deer looks, and that'll look really funky. So even though you can bend rules when you're stylizing stuff, there is a sense of realism in how you make your design choices and how you create joints and other things like that needs to make sense. Because visually it'll just look weird. And I can tell you this right now, I've seen a lot of designs, especially things like dragons, where the wings just don't have any structure. They don't have a support system. They don't look like they have a good joint in there. And it looks bad. It just looks bad. It's not really that it's an awful design choice necessarily inherently, but it means when that dragon's moving around on screen, it's going to look a little ridiculous. I'm not going to believe, even if I don't know animal anatomy, that thing can move, because something about it looks wrong. And I think a lot of people, especially non-artists, can still tell when something looks wrong, right? I think even if you don't know animal anatomy, you can tell a leg on a deer going this direction with the scapula sticking out is not correct. It looks kind of strange. And if you go out of your way to do something like, keep the scapula over here, to not have it bend out, that just looks weird too. It looks strange. It'll look really weird when you animate it. It'll look really weird when you draw with it and have it do the things that you're saying it can do, but visually it doesn't look like it can do. So you sort of run into issues of confusion if you start breaking this part, the reality of how joints actually work. If the joint needs to be able to go up here, give them a different joint. Right? You're going to start adjusting anatomy to accommodate your design, and that's where your design choices are going to actually start coming into effect, right? Is when you take into account not only the demands of what your creature is supposedly going to need to do for the project or for the assignment, but also realistically what certain joints and structures can actually do. And these are things that you can learn through doing a few different types of research. I would honestly say the best types of research are videos. Now, videos is a bit vague. I'll be more specific. Videos here means more so that you're going to look at videos of how the animal moves. So if you need to design something based off of a bald eagle, right? There's lots of videos of people, you know, flying bald eagles, have pet bald eagles in zoos, right? You're going to want to go look at that and see how it flaps its wings, see how it moves its head, right? You're going to want to look at reference so that you can see in context how the creature is moving and what it's doing and able to do. It's one thing to look at a skeleton. It's one thing to say, he needs to be able to pick up a fork with his wing. It's another thing to see a wing actually working and to see what the creature does comfortably. I think if you can tell if a creature looks uncomfortable or not based on, how its body's structured, you're already in the right direction, right? If you look at a cat and its arms are at an odd angle and you can tell that it looks kind of uncomfortable, it's probably because that's not naturally how the arms are supposed to go. Usually creatures don't do things their body isn't built for. Some animals will make mistakes, but generally speaking, animals like to do things that are comfortable and make sense for their structure. So that's kind of one thing to look at. The second thing to look at for reference that's really helpful is to look at gesture studies or studies in general by other artists. Now, I'm not saying you need to copy them or anything, but when you look at a new animal you've never studied before that you're not familiar with, it's similar to anything really as a designer that you're not at all familiar with. Just looking at how other artists approach it will help you get a good understanding on some of the basics that they're aware of that you're not aware of yet. If you don't know how to draw a car, and cars are confusing, it'd probably be more useful, to be honest, if you go look at a car designer and how they sketch a car, just see what they actually do, what things they think are important and get down on the paper first, what things they're approaching, how they're going about fixing it and planning it. Those are kinds of the things you're going to take from that. You're not going to take that drawing of a car and just redo it yourself necessarily, but you're going to look at how they approach it. And the same thing sort of comes into play when you're talking about animal anatomy and more experienced animal artists, because they have a really, usually a strong grip and understanding of how the animal is structured. So you could look at people like Claire Wendeling. She's a really good artist for animals, but there's quite a few around. Terrell Whitlatch is also great. Terrell, I'll write their names here just so you can see how they're spelt. I believe that's how you spell their last name. I think there's two T's actually. But looking at some artists who actually know what they're talking about, very, very helpful. And it can kind of give you a pointer in what direction to go, especially if you're not familiar with it. And the third thing is obviously looking at anatomy like this, right? Beyond just kind of looking at pictures of some dogs for your dog creature, you should go look at their bones a little bit, their muscles a little bit, right? That's going to really get you kind of familiar with some of the more in-depth parts of their anatomy that you wouldn't normally notice, which brings me to some of the notes I'll make very quickly about these groups of creatures here. The first being, this is a herbivore. They're built to stand. And they're also built to be able to eat while standing. Hello. Very cute drawing there. But that's kind of what we're going to see, right? Long neck, long legs, but this neck needs to be able to get its head down here. That is a mandatory requirement of a herbivore, typically speaking, is that they need to be able to eat while standing, and then you'll be able to immediately, quickly revert themselves to a standing pose while eating, fast enough to run away from predators. There's very few herbivores that don't have this requirement. You're going to see that in environments with no predators at times, but generally speaking, this is a good rule of thumb to think about herbivores needing to be able to run easily while eating. Actually, I'll just put run in caps because I think you'll understand. The next is going to be predators. This is a feline. This is a lion. Now, lions need to be able to change speed quickly, but you'll notice that this creature has some features that the deer does not. It's tilting a lot more than this deer is, huh? The pelvis, scapula, rib cage. These are all tilting. They're very even and parallel over here. But that's not the case for this cat. It's not the case for most predators. That's because they need to use energy in bursts while chasing prey, and oftentimes they're not going to need to stand to maintain feeding or other behaviors. They'll be able to just, essentially speaking, take a nap, right? So he's nappy. He doesn't need to stand. He needs to be able to run, so he has this forward momentum, he has this aggression in his posture and stance, but he also doesn't need to maintain a standing posture for very long. And he can't, realistically, right? It takes muscles. I mean, you've probably stood still before, and your legs are straight when you're standing. If you've tried to stand in a squat, it's not fun. You get tired. Your muscles get tired. You're in a good stance to run. When you're squatting, you're already kind of in that posture, but it sucks to stand like that, and that's because it's activating all these muscles to hold it in place. You're not in this kind of nice entropy in the middle, and that's because humans, generally speaking, are built a little bit more well-rounded compared to these two animals, because humans would spend a lot of time doing both activities: hunting and gathering, live prey, and also vegetation. But that's besides the point. You're going to kind of see these are two different categories. Right. Typically speaking, you're not going to see animals often that have both of these features, because that would kind of be impossible to have a parallel and slanted ribcage at the same time, unless it has multiple, in which case that sounds like a wacky creature. The next two are going to be something kind of complicated. This is a bird. This is a duck. We love ducks. Ducks are great. One of the things about birds that's very kind of upsetting, to me personally, and also should be notable to creature designers, is that the ribcage pelvis is fused. They actually cannot bend their spine. Birds cannot bend their spine at all. It's beyond this point, between these 2 points, the exit for the tail and the exit for the neck, this spine cannot move. This bird is stuck. These are all fused together. And that's going to be really important when you're going in and talking about these pivots, right? About this structural function, about what it can actually do and how it can move, right? Your bird literally cannot move here in nature. So if you're designing a bird character, thusly, it would be a bit strange if they started bending their back, like stretching their ribs, right? If they're stretching, it's probably going to be their feathers or their wings stretching out, not this. This is not going to move. And if it does, it'll start looking a little weird, and people are not going to know why they think it looks strange, right? But they think it will look strange, And we want to avoid that. We want to avoid people going, that seems kind of funky. I don't think that's realistic. I don't think that works, right? We're going to want to try to not have that happen in our designs. And another notable thing about birds is that their sternum here is also fused. So these little clavicles, kind of the part that lets your kind of scapula move here, in birds is also fused down, and that's because they have they're creating this huge platform, this huge blade that muscles are going to attach to. Birds have a huge amount of muscle on their chest and almost nowhere else. It's all right there. That's why if you get meat from a bird like chicken, you'll usually get chicken breast and things like that, and it's usually pretty big because that's the part of the bird where a lot of muscle is. Now, lastly is going to be reptiles. Now, the reason I have a top view of a reptile versus the side views you see here is simply because reptiles are a bit confusing compared to other quadrupeds in general. And we're not talking about snakes here. We're talking more so newts, lizards, that kind of thing, crocs, The reason why they're a bit strange is that the way they're structured is that their legs are on the side of their body, not below the body. You'll notice in these creatures that the legs go below the body, right? These scapula are kind of to the side, right? These structures are on the side. On lizards, because their arms are on the sides of their body, their shoulder blades and things actually go on top, and thus their pectorals and stuff go underneath. And what this means is that their leg movement is very different. You've all seen a lizard run. Their body kind of does this weird back and forth movement where there's like this, it almost seems like there's central pivot here, and as one side goes one way, the other side goes the other way, right? They're swinging back and forth with their front and back, alternating as they run. And the reason that's happening is because that's how they need to move their legs. The legs don't have any clearance from the ground. So the only way that they can actually generate movement or clearance is by holding it up and then physically shifting this entire pivot point forward, or this entire pivot point back. They can't actually just move the leg itself to generate movement. And that causes a few different problems for lizards, but it's something important to note if you're designing a reptile that the movement's going to be quite different and quite substantially different in that sense. Another, byproduct of this is that lizards can't breathe when they run, because when they're compressing all these muscles, when they're activating all these muscles that go right over their lungs, it compresses them so much they can't inhale. So actually, you'll note that a lot of reptiles will move, and this is true somewhat for snakes as well, where basically just a bunch of organs in a tube that's being constricted by muscles as they move. They can't breathe while they're moving, so they'll have to run, and then stop. Right, so that's going to really affect your function and your movement of your creature if it's a reptile. If you're basing it on real reptiles. Now, a lot of dragons, you've probably seen, have a structure closer to this, right? Especially Western dragons, right? The legs tend to be lower. They tend to look a little bit more like a horse. And that's functionally a good thing for them in that it now makes sense that they can be, say, flapping their wings and breathe at the same time, right? If a creature's going to be flapping its wings to move, and it can't breathe while it's flying, what's it going to do? Stop flapping and just fall? Every time it needs to breathe in? That's not a great feature, right? So you're going to need to, in design, accommodate for stuff like this by making changes, because otherwise it'll start looking kind of wrong. Right? If we just slapped some bat wings on the back of a Komodo dragon, it would look a bit strange, so we do need to make some accommodations, oftentimes. Otherwise it'll, again, look kind of funky, and we want to avoid that. And so that kind of concludes the section talking about functionality of creatures and why we're kind of taking the time to not only look at the structure and the overall look of creatures and their gesture, but also in terms of like what type of movement the creature can actually do practically. What makes sense, right? It needs to kind of visually make sense. It doesn't need to be perfect. I'm not saying, you need to go make these huge anatomical charts every time you create a creature. That's not at all what you need to do, but you do need to kind of have a rough understanding of what the difference is between different types of pivot points and how things can move. And if you're not sure about a pivot point, use your own body, use your elbow, use your knee, use your shoulder. Look how much that arm can move. Look what that joint is. If you can't understand something, you are your own test subject, and you can easily look up human anatomy on Google. Check comparatively what kind of structures are around those joints and what kind of movement do they allow. Is there muscle in the way blocking it, etc., etc. So that's kind of an important thing to consider. Is not only do you have creatures and all this anatomical reference you can usually find on the internet, but also you have yourself, because you are in a weird way a very odd looking creature, a bipedal creature, which is very rare, generally speaking, in nature. The last part of this lecture before demoing is going to be about design. Now, these are just some drawings I've done. These are by no means the best out there or meant to break any new ground or revolutionize your life, but they're meant to kind of show you just some design principles in play. So now we talked a little bit before about that predatory energy of something looking like it's pushing forward, right? We compared the dogs before and saw this huge difference in this kind of stable squared shape versus this kind of pointed leaning shape. And that's going to come true, we kind of ring true in some of our design principles as well, right? I think a lot of you have heard that in terms of design, circles are friendly, squares are strong and sturdy, and triangles are aggressive. And why is that? Why does that energy matter when we talk about a creature? This is talking about momentum a lot of the time. A frog is pretty round, they look pretty friendly, when they're just sitting there, right? They're just cute little guys. They look pretty innocuous, pretty unharmful overall. Even though when you look at the side of view of some frogs, they actually start having this little momentum going, where they kind of look like they could jump at any time, and that's because they have these huge haunches in the back. But generally speaking, overall, compared to a lot of different animals, something like a frog or maybe even like a hamster, right? they're gonna look kind of friendly, and they're gonna look kind of, in a sense, they almost look immobile, or they look like they're not really gonna change shape. They look pretty stable, but stable in a way that's not strong. They're stable in a way that's kind of harmless, and inoffensive in a sense. Whereas more boxy creatures, you're getting into cows and horses here, right? Um, this is a cute little horse, but you kind of get into creatures like this, herbivores especially. They start to look pretty stable. They look pretty reliable, but they don't look necessarily friendly, right? They don't look aggressive. I don't know if I, think a horse looks like it's gonna hurt me, but I don't know if I quite trust the horse to be really friendly, right? If I see a horse in the wild, that creature looks like it's not a predator, but it's also, not a cute little round hamster or jellyfish or frog. It's not something that I think I can just pick up. Or kind of look closer at, or maybe like a little fat cat, right? Like a little fat cat is a pretty innocuous creature too, but horses really have this more aggressive stance compared to this round creature, but not quite to the point of me being like, that thing's gonna eat me. But I don't necessarily trust or distrust it. I think a lot of the time in design, people shout that the square and boxy things look reliable and trustworthy, and in a lot of cases they do. But for creatures, one note that I have from personal experience is that they don't necessarily read that way, because boxy can also mean very large in size, and I think as creatures get larger, they start to look scarier to people. Just naturally, right? Like if you saw a whale that's 6 inches long, you're like, that's just a cute little fish. But if you see a 30-ton whale, now it's a bit concerning, right? That's whales are round, wonderful, friendly creatures, but at the same time, they're really big and you're really small, so they're kind of scary, even though they're pretty friendly shaped. So the same rule kind of applies here, where a lot of creatures that actually have this form language tend to be medium to large sized in real life. So it'll look a little strange if you start applying this, design principle or boxier shapes to creatures that are meant to be small. So that's just kind of something I've noticed. Again, take this with a grain of salt. This is my personal experience designing, but that's something that you might want to keep in mind. And then the triangle is aggressive. I think we all know why triangles are aggressive. They have this kind of, they're pointy, they look like they could hurt you. They also have this unstable energy. And so you can see over here some of these shape applications of a more rounded versus a more boxy versus a more triangular torso shape. These are from the side as if the creature was like standing here, right? These are like a torso shape similar to what we saw on the dogs before, that was in red, which I'll quickly show again for context, right? This kind of shape that we have going on here. These are kind of like examples of how you can start to imagine a more boxy creature with this shape, right? Or start to see how this creature could feel like it's really a lot more aggressive than something like this, and this feels a lot more sturdy and possibly larger, honestly, than something like this, which could be more like a frog. And so when I go to apply some of these principles to design when I'm sketching for myself, I tend to look at orthographic views of creatures. You can design in 3/4, you can design however you want. In my opinion, I think whenever you're doing design of something that's kind of complicated in 3-dimensional space and has a lot of features that you want to make sure work, using orthographic views or simple views makes your life easier. I think a lot of people would say that designing a car engine one piece at a time is a little easier than designing it all at once. And the same can kind of apply with shape language in a design, right? If you approach one shape at a time, one view at a time, it makes your life a little easier. So I tend to do side views because, like I was saying before, for all of these quadrupeds that we were looking at, the side view is pretty descriptive of the forms and of the structures. For reptiles, less so, I would say, because they tend to be flatter to the ground. There's a lot less information on the side, or the information's getting obscured. But for a lot of creatures, or most that you'll end up designing, honestly, the side view is a pretty great place to start, because you're going to get the posture, the gesture, and some of these are all based on owls. all of these designs. They're based on barn owls, actually, and I was making a barn owl griffin type creature, a quadruped that's inspired by an owl, with a little bit of kind of feline feel in there. And you can see that all of them kind of play with different proportions and different gestures for how intense this sort of slant is. How far is their body pushing forward? For some of them, it's not really pushing forward very much at all. And for some of them, it's a very blatant kind of push, like this creature here, right? This has a kind of blockier feel, but it still has that forward momentum. And all of these, pretty much, to varying degrees for some of them, I would honestly say this one's probably the least the least forward momentum. It has a pretty even stance, actually, based on the tilt of its back. But for a lot of these, they have that forward momentum that I want from the feline. So they have that aggressive posture, but they also mix in some of these other shapes, right? Like a lot of them have these very rounded owl-like shapes, or like these discs, like the radial discs on an owl's face. Owls have a very flat face, so some of them really implement them. Some of them really curve it. Some of them make it a little bit more boxy, right? Some of them really just make it flat. Right, so there's a lot of different approaches you can have to design and get a lot of this like variance and shape in here, while still following some of the basic structural and functional principles we talked about before. And you can even see in a lot of these sketches these little circles I'm drawing. And these are just thumbnails that I drew for myself, but you can see these pivot points, right? I'm making notes to myself, where are these joints and how is it standing, right? And that's always going to be something you want to think about. This is another set of orthos for a different creature design that's meant to be a bit more scary. It's based on a deer mixed with a deer tick. So it's a kind of aggressive creature that inflates. It has different stages of its life cycle. And this creature, while it has this really round shape at the top, is pretty unsettling because it has this really aggressive, pointed, right, stance to it. It's kind of creepy. It's elongated in a way similar to the maned wolf that looks unusual, right? Like if your creature starts having weird traits like this that look odd, you're going to want to make sure they look odd intentionally. And kind of keep in mind some of these shapes, right? I'm really keeping in mind here, the more deflated view, you can see some of this anatomy indication. I'm thinking about the pelvis tilt, right? I'm thinking about the rib cage tilt, right? I'm thinking about how this thing moves. So this thing, while looking kind of like a deer in some cases, is very predatory looking, right? You're getting that sense that something is off about it, and it's predatory, it's sharp, it's aggressive. And so that's kind of some of the basics of how these shapes actually apply. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of these before regarding design. If you've listened to anything relating to design, this comes up a lot. But this is kind of how I'm thinking about it and applying it in my mind. So it's not a steadfast thing that the creature needs to be round everywhere, or square everywhere, or pointy everywhere. As a designer, you're gonna be mixing shapes together, especially in anatomy. Anatomy has a lot of stuff going on, a lot of shapes, a lot of structures, and you're gonna want to apply this information, intentionally, to get a sense of gesture, or to get a sense of the sort of feel of the creature, how it moves, how it hunts, how it lives. That's what creature design ends up being about, even for things like Disney. Even this example down here is a recent project I did for academic purposes, and this is a pretty generic sort of crocodile, you'll say. It's a crocodile-like creature. That's fine. But one of the weird things about this is, look at the legs. You remember how before I said the lizard's legs are on the side of its body? That includes crocodiles and alligators. But these legs go down. It can stand up. So it's a pretty big deviation. This creature's structure is atypical. And while it might be subtle, how this creature moves now is a lot more like a dinosaur or something else, where the legs go below the body, than it is like a crocodile. And I made these structural changes intentionally for the requirements of the project and what I was requested to do. But that's something, again, where this kind of comes into mind. So I was thinking about how this creature needs to move, what kind of clearance it needs to be, right? This creature does not drag itself across the ground. It has clearance. Whereas a crocodile does not. It drags itself. It can drag itself pretty fast, and at times kick so hard it lifts itself off the ground when it's running through sheer force. But naturally, its legs don't really clear itself off the ground, and it spends most of its time sitting or lying on its belly. So that's kind of a major structural difference here, right? Even for something simple like this, even for some design like this that's more so just kind of meant to be a bit more realistic for its requirements, you can make huge changes like this, and then it really impacts, the shape of the belly, right? The strength of the belly, the structure of it, the structure of where the hips are going to go, the pelvis shape, how that gesture is going to curve, stuff like that, right? So all of this is kind of impacted by a mixture of the requirements that you're given at the beginning, the set of functions it needs to do, and the set of functions you're allowing it to do. And that kind of, concludes, my basic introduction to how I would approach creature design. I know this is pretty general, and I know a lot of it was kind of perhaps gibberish that's more so design focused than creature anatomy, but I hope that it was helpful, and I can also do some, I've prepared time to do some live drawing and demos if anyone has any requests for questions, or if they want me to break down any specific creatures that they find to be difficult or interesting regarding this approach. And I'm also going to drink water. Sorry, I wasn't reading the chat. Let me read it now. Sorry about that. Yeah, this is a recorded lecture. You don't have to say anything out loud to ask questions. I will be reading it right now. Yeah, I'm glad it was helpful. Yeah, yeah, I understand. You don't need to ruin it's not ruining the recording if you ask a question. But if you do have any questions about specific things, like how you'd apply this to any animals or things related to projects you're doing, you can feel free to send those. I could also talk a little bit about mixing human and animal anatomy if you want. That's another thing I could talk a little bit about. All right. That's not necessarily the focus of the lecture, but I can go into that if you guys want me to talk about that for a bit. Alright, I'll read the question out for the recording. Question, we always talk about big, medium, small in design. So for animation and more cartoony designs, we can push it more. But for realistic stuff like you do, the ratio isn't as obvious. Then how do I push shapes? That's a good question. I think one of the things that comes up in design a lot, I'll start to hide some of this stuff. In terms of design, is when is it pushed too far? What defines realism, right? I think realism in design, as a general rule of thumb, is related to one, the finish of something. So that's going to be texture. Right, that's going to be the difference. If you've seen a 3D model of a horse or a person, and there's no texturing on the surface, it's like smooth, like butter or plastic, it looks really weird, right? But if we start adding the pores and the hairs and little things, even stuff that's kind of low poly will start to look sort of realistic, because it has that finish that we're used to seeing in real life. Or you could almost call this being HD, right? Having this kind of realistic level of nuance and organic variance in the texture of something. That's going to be, relating to anything, right? Like, you can see anatomy charts of perfect deltoids that are shaped really smoothly. Deltoids, for context, for people who don't know what that is the shoulder muscle in a human or in most creatures. Right? You'll see that muscle is drawn really smoothly, kind of like this. And that's great and everything. That's kind of what it looks like. But in humans, there's gonna be little bumps and flaws, right? So anything in real life is kind of flawed and has, abnormalities that make it not perfect. And so, realism a lot of the time in design ends up being about finish, but also too is about a focus on, I want to say, realistic function. What this means is, for me, focus on realistic function means that if I see a certain type of joint for example, let's talk about like an elbow joint, right? Where you have this kind of this is a 3/4 view of it, really shittily, but it's basically a pivot system where you have a hinge of two things that can go either way. When I see this joint, if I'm focusing on realistic function, it means I'm not going to let that joint do anything kind of off. Or if I see a hoof on a cow, this is how an animation person would kind of stylize it, right? They'll kind of divide it into like these three parts. They're like the sort of fingers, quote unquote, and this is like the thumb, because animators tend to like having thumbs on things so the creatures can pick stuff up. This sort of structure doesn't really make sense realistically, right? Like if these are solid parts, you're going to kind of deal with, imagine having little concrete blocks cemented over each of your set of fingers and trying to pick something up. That sounds horrific. That sounds terrible. I think you're going to have a terrible time. But animation lets that work. It's a little bit more flexible, right? Maybe these are hard hooves, but in animation they're a little more gummy. They're a little more soft. They're a little able to do things that they shouldn't really be able to do. So I think realism honestly ends up being about these things, and that ends up affecting how far you can push shapes. Because if I make a creature, for example, that has proportions like this, right? This is a really weird creature. I'm gonna make it like a bear, right? This is what your bear looks like. I don't think I've seen a bear that looks like this, and I don't think this thing is accommodated to what a bear does. I don't think its lifestyle really makes sense. But in animation, you could probably get away with something looking like this and calling it a bear, a really weird bear. And that's because, I think in animation, you can kind of fudge some of the realistic functionality of things. It's kind of like our dogs, right? If you have a cute dog that's really meant for like, being a friend, Bow Wow, right? Cute little doggy. It's probably going to have this more structural shape, realistically, in real life, because dogs are bred for very specific tasks. And so animation ends up honestly pushing the shapes in a way that's more so about expression than it is about function. And I think that, the defining what choices you're making based on expression versus making them based on function is going to be the key between realism and not realism. Yeah, My Little Pony, exactly. That's like a really big, that's a good example of how, My Little Ponies really don't look like horses. They kind of look like them if you're squinting. But imagine a My Little Pony in real life. Like, what material would that hoof have to be made out of for it to pick things up like that? The answer is I don't know. I don't know of any realistic material that can do that. That also the creature is going to walk on with like this flat plane. Sounds like it's going to pinch. It looks like kind of fleshy, and if it pinches the flesh against the ground, that sounds like it would hurt. I don't think a creature would realistically want feet like that. So I think when you're talking about the difference for stylized versus realistic work, I think honestly in both you can really push shapes, but there's different limitations for when those shapes are or are not appropriate and why you're pushing the shapes, right? Like, why are you giving your horse really long legs? Is it because you want the horse to look like a dancer and look really graceful for an animation, or is it because your horse structurally for your project runs long distances? Maybe it's more like an Arabian horse versus a American Mustang, right? There are different breeds of horse who do different things, run in different environments. So what's motivating your decisions, I think, in either case stylistically is based on kind of the demands of your project you're designing for. Hopefully that sort of makes sense, because I naturally work in a pretty stylized, pushed way, but can cater to realism relatively easily because realism just requires that I be a little more careful about my choices and a little bit more intentional about how they affect the function of the creature versus the expression that the creature's trying to make. And so vice versa, if you're going into animation with this approach, right, I can say all the stuff in the world I like about how your animal should be able to move right, but like I said, you can fudge it a little bit, right? Like My Little Ponies can move however they want. I don't really remember what they look like. I think they're kind of, they have these big anime eyes. You know, whatever, right? Um, but this thing is so nebulous. It can move however it wants, right? Um, I don't think it's really limited as nearly as much because the functionality is a lot more obscured, right? The materials, the specifics are a lot more obscured. So I think realism honestly ends up just being about, realistic application of the finish, the polish, the kind of presentation, the texture of the creature, right? That final polish of how it looks, mixed with a sense of why you're making design choices. I think that's the only real difference. So in big, medium, small kind of applies in the same way. It's just that why are you using the big, medium, small in the case of realism, right? Are you showing, if the head is really big on my alligator, like I'll just draw a couple quick alligators, right? So this is one alligator. He's a friend. Very cute. He's got the big spikes on him. Now, if I draw one where he's about the same body size, but his head is really big, you're kind of asking yourself, God, why is that head so big? What does this creature need to do? And so instead of you saying, in animation, you'd say stuff like, he has a big head, right? And like that's kind of a visual indicator of like an expression or an emotion, right? That's an emotional response you're trying to get from your viewer. Whereas if you're looking for more realistic application, like in more realistic styles, typically this question is, what is it eating? Or what does it do with its mouth? Right, that's the question you're more concerned with than the emotional response of this big head. Obviously the emotional response matters as a designer for entertainment media, but in terms of realism, I'm much more concerned now in real life why its head is this big. What the hell is it doing with its head? that's spurring it to evolve this way. So that's kind of the different. You're kind of asking yourself different design questions with each point of view. Would be my personal opinion regarding the difference between more realistic approach and a more stylized approach. So hopefully that answers the question. If it does, then I can move into the character, the human application as well. I'm glad that was a good answer. Humans are kind of weird. Humans have a lot of specific traits. So humans, in a lot of ways, kind of have a very specific sort of body structure. And we sort of approach them from a different way we approach most other creatures. Generally speaking, if I look at a human compared to like a dog, or not even a dog, let's try a different animal. Let's try a bird. Right, a bird tends to have, again, we're going to keep in mind this like fused rib cage that we talked about before, right? This whole big thing up here is like one shape, right? We talk about a little birdie, or like a whatever kind of bird. We're just going to make up a bird-like thing. If we compare these two things, they're quite different, but they do have similarities. I think humans and other animals, because humans are animals, we have a lot of the same structures. And a lot of the time, if you talk to animal creature designers who are talking about designing creatures being more character-like, it will define the difference as being like, are they, more than like 50% human tends to be a character, and more than 50% animal tends to be a creature. And I think, most of you would kind of agree something roughly like that is true, right? If you see a duck that has like eyebrows on ArtStation or something, you'd say that that's like a creature that has weird eyebrows. Um, it's more of like an animal, right? It's not necessarily like a humanoid character. Yeah. But if you start to mess with the body proportions, like that picture of Donald Duck you just posted, right? Donald Duck has like human proportions. He has human hands, human arms, human expressions. He can talk. He can walk on two legs. Now we're getting into the zone of it being more of a character. And of course, a lot of people would define both of these things as a character, quote unquote. I personally make a line where I think of character meaning something that's again more humanoid, and then creatures being something that's more animal, even though both can have human personalities or be supplementary humans in a film or any other kind of media, right? Like, I think we've all seen like 101 Dalmatians or movies like that where we have literal animals that can just talk like people and we see them as characters versus creatures, right? And it's mostly because they're basically a human brain put into a dog body in the case of 100 Dalmatians, right? 101 Dalmatians. Right, they're not necessarily really an animal anymore, so we're thinking of them as a character. But for my definition of a character here, I'm talking more so about the anatomical difference versus the narrative difference between a human and a creature, which I think they're quite different things, right? Like if I compare the difference between something in a story versus something visually as a design, we're going to use different language. So I just want to clarify really quickly that this is the way I'm defining these two things, visually and anatomically. When you start mixing these two things, I think the main thing you want to look at is similar structures, and that's going to be regarding some of the stuff we talked about with pivots, right? Where is that movement? What kind of movement is it? We're going to talk about similar structures. So that's going to be really stuff like, shoulders, or like maybe like legs, right? Like things that we understand as like a general anatomical object or section of a body that makes sense to us. I think when you start getting into weird specific things like these animals both have small intestines, I don't think people care, and I don't think you care either. I don't think it makes a huge difference. It's a cool detail to know that maybe a human has a small intestine and say like a certain type of jellyfish you found does not. But in terms of the general structures, right, it's more important to note that a jellyfish doesn't have a head and a human has a head, right? These are more large physical features that I can tell are different, right? Jellyfish is just kind of chilling, And this thing is so different from a human. Yeah, there's almost no structural similarities between these two creatures. And so it's going to be a lot harder, design-wise, to start making something look like it's both of these things. So when you're kind of approaching mixing creatures and humans together and that anatomical kind of blend of the two, I think, outside of just the pivots, similar structures, if you're getting to the point where there's not really similar structures, you're going to have to look at similar looking whoops, I wrote that letter wrong. Similar looking structures. Now, you might say to yourself, similar structures look like each other. That's true. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But similar looking structures means that humans have arms, they got the little hands, and jellyfish have tentacles. Now, these things are not structurally similar, they're not functionally similar. They do very different things. They have very different cells. They don't have, this doesn't have any joints in it. There's joints in here. But they kind of visually look similar. And so you're going to start equating things that visually look similar, even though the structure is not similar. And when you start doing that, that's when you're going to start applying some of this anatomical knowledge and building your own structures out of nothing. If I want to make a jellyfish person and I decide that I want the arms to kind of look like tentacles, I'm going to need to go look into what tentacles do functionally, right? Do they sting things, right? And how do they do that? What in a tentacle stings? And I'm going to look at some of the functions of these two unlike things and try to bring some of them over into each other. So maybe I'm going to have the structure of an arm right here, but maybe it has this sort of like membrane that's hanging off of it, and maybe that membrane has a bunch of these like stinging cells. right? Maybe he has, or maybe it doesn't even have a hand. Maybe it's more of like a set of kind of like a sock or like a mitten, right? It's kind of this like fused thing so that you don't have individual fingers, right? So this new structure that I've made is kind of me combining or getting the best I can of these two very dissimilar structures and objects and making something completely new. And yet, it has features like it has this clear elbow, it has this clear wrist, it has this clear hand from the human anatomy. And maybe I look at this and I say, oh no, this is too similar, right? Like this just looks like a human arm with some dressing on it. I want to change it even more. So maybe, it has a joint up here, but then it doesn't have any other joints. So now you're getting into something kind of soft that has, movement, right? And maybe it has these stinging cells in it. Right, so now we're getting into something that's trying to mix it even more, because I said, this has the features I want, but it's too human, or it's not fulfilling the requirements, because maybe your design is meant to look more like a creature, right? But it has humanoid traits. So maybe this is something closer to what you want. Right. So when you're kind of designing humanoid characters that have animal features, you're going to want to look at these things first. And then if all else fails, which happens sometimes, you're going to want to look at texture or material. I'm going to refer to it as well. Material is what the stuff is made out of. So that's kind of, we talked about that a little here, how there's these stinging cells or this membrane, because those are things humans don't really have. I mean, humans have membranes. Membranes are a pretty generic word, but they don't have like membranes that hang off of them and do other stuff, really. And so you're going to start seeing, maybe to really nail home that this is a jellyfish person, I'm going to make them out of like a jelly. And it's literally just a jelly, right? Their body's made of jelly. And you're going to start doing stuff that mirrors material changes, because human flesh and jelly from a jellyfish are very different compounds. They're very different structures. They're very different things. On a biology level and a structural level, right? We all know that human bodies have a bit more structure to them than like a disc of jelly does. There's bones in there. We have ligaments. We have attachments. We have organs. We have, like internal skeletons that protect other internal objects. We have like layers of protection for things and all this complicated stuff. We have blood systems, we have full organ tracts that go from one end to the next. We've got a lot of stuff going on in there that's very not similar to this creature. So if you start having problems, and these things aren't working, or at least they're not doing as much as you want them to. I can't really think of any sense or any time when these things don't work, so these are good starting points. But if you're really trying to nail something home in a very blatant and clear kind of way, a lot of the time your texture and material choices for that creature design are gonna really help you out. If it's if you're combining like a dragonfly and say maybe like a tiger, right? Two very dissimilar creatures. They're very different because you got the dragonfly. So I'm just going to put a list here. This is how I approach design when I'm working by myself. I make a list of requirements or a list of features. So dragonflies have an exoskeleton, which means they have the bones on the outside, and tigers have a normal skeleton, internal skeleton. It's on the inside. We're also going to note that there's fur here. No fur here. We're also going to note this can fly. This can't fly. This runs. / climbs. Right, because tigers can climb and they can swim. Right. So they can do a lot of things. They have limbs that let them do quite a bit. It's also a predator. So a predator that hunts stuff. Dragonflies, I don't believe are predators. I believe they eat things that can't really run away from them. So we're just going to say sedentary. Well, actually, sedentary doesn't really get that across. We're going to say non-aggressive, I think is a better descriptor for a dragonfly. And we're going to say small, because they're small. And these are large to medium, right? They're pretty big creatures, tigers. So you can see here there's quite a bit of difference between these two creatures. And so if I want to merge them together, I need to think about which of these things that are completely opposing I want to keep and which I want to try to combine. Because I could theoretically, if it has an if I want to keep the exoskeleton, I'm getting rid of most of that internal skeleton at least. But maybe I could combine the fur and the exoskeleton, right? If I want to have that furry look, maybe it has these like spines that come off the surface of the skin, right? Like that look kind of like fur when you zoom out, because there's a whole bunch of them or something, right? And they're like layering on top of the surface, right? And so there's kind of, this is where your design sense comes in. When you're asking yourself these kinds of questions, you just need to understand what you're looking at, understand what functions it has, right? What features it has, and understand what you want to keep, or what's better yet, just besides from what you want to keep. So these are just things I wanted to keep for myself, right? This is when you say like, this is cool. I think this idea is cool, and your art director will be like, yeah, that looks cool, right? It's cool, but it needs to do, what the demands are, what functions are required, right? So if the creature needs to, like, for example, in this case, be low poly, right? Really low res. It's maybe for a game, maybe you're making it for a game project that's meant to be like throwback to something like Spyro. Maybe having all these little projections I just drew, it's a bad idea. We don't have that many polys to work with. So now I'm kind of violating the requirements or the demands that were given to me for this design. So even though this is a cool idea that I wanted to keep, it doesn't work. Just bottom line, cool idea. Glad I thought of it. Glad I tried it, but it doesn't work, and that's fine. Design is a lot of trial and error. So if you're if you're combining human and creature anatomy, this is the kind of way I would approach it. In terms of just that base level of trying to figure out what features are important to you. And this is, of course, applying with basic design principles in mind, which is like the thing we mentioned before in a great question was big, medium, and small. Big, medium, and small is not something I think I need to cover here. If you're interested in it, there's lots of good videos that kind of break it down on YouTube, floating around and stuff. But principles like that, like value, contrast, color, etc., these other design principles are also applying to all of this, right? So these are just specific concerns we have with this specific prompt of this type of design we're trying to make, if that makes sense. So hopefully this kind of gives you a general idea of how you could go about approaching it. And a lot of it's going to be trial and error. You're going to maybe make the arms really long or the legs really small and see if that visually works or not. Does it look too goofy? What does and doesn't work? I think a lot of it comes from trial and error. Sometimes you just got to draw some wacky, crazy, bad drawings to figure out that you just don't need to do that in the future because it doesn't work already. And so I think the specifics of human anatomy and creature anatomy would be really great if you're not familiar with either of these subjects to pick up a lecture or a lesson on human anatomy and or creature anatomy. I would recommend learning human anatomy first and then going into creatures, because a lot of the human stuff carries over, and the human stuff is easier for you to understand because it's on your own body, right? So you can test and play with it yourself, or you can grab a friend and tell them to like kick a wood block or something and see what happens. So I think that's kind of a starting point, is having a basic understanding of anatomy and structure, like we talked about at the beginning. Kind of looking at what stuff looks like, how it's built, what it's meant to do. Knowing that kind of information sounds really basic and general, but it does become very specific when you have specific prompts or specific requirements for a design, right? We've all had to design something before, and you're like, okay, I need to make a samurai warrior that also looks like he's from modern day Tokyo and also looks like he's, or like some random thing like a deity or has godly powers and also is part lion. You have all these weird components that are required for the design, and now you're trying to figure out what lions look like, you're trying to figure out what samurai look like, you're trying to figure out if you can make certain things anatomical or certain things costume based, right? You're doing all this problem solving. So a lot of this stuff is going to be based on case by case, right? So hopefully this sort of general approach I described of kind of listing stuff out, looking at how stuff's built, looking at how it moves and functions, and then trying to apply some of the basic principles and try to just understand on a basic level what you're working with, what you're trying to do, and why, should kind of get you most of the way for any type of design, whether that's creature or not, but it especially applies here very, I think, smoothly and visually into creature design, including, these humanoid creatures where you're trying to mix together different types of traits. And so hopefully that kind of answers the question. I don't know if I rambled too long or got too sidetracked. Sometimes I do that. But that's sort of my approach. Yeah, I'll wait to see if there's any more questions too. Feel free to ask anything you want. I'm glad it was helpful. I tried to make something that was pretty general utility, so that you guys could have something that's applicable in a lot of cases. Do I have any design from games or movies that I saw and I think don't work? There's a lot of those. I really tend to not bring up examples of bad design in recorded sessions or other things like that because I really don't want to bash any artists in particular. I think a lot of the time you'll find if you see a really ugly design in a movie or something, I can almost guarantee you that the artist really didn't want to do it and management forced them to change it to fit whatever the requirements were. So a lot of the time bad design actually isn't based on designers making bad choices, it's actually based on management making bad choices. So I think if you look at a movie or look at a creature design, you can tell when something's working for you or not. If something starts getting in the uncanny valley or looks freaky, I think you're starting to see designs that are perhaps making bad choices, right? They look a little bit odd. It'd be great to see how I construct a side view for the tiger dragonfly to see how to apply to structure. Yeah, sure. So let me grab a reference of a dragonfly because I want to emphasize too it's good to work with reference. So let me grab a dragonfly side view here. Let me grab a tiger side view here. Yeah, this will work just fine. Okay. So we've got a couple cuties here. I like tigers, they're good. So I'm gonna kind of define based on my list. Let's go back to our list, right? So let's kind of flesh out what the design prompt is, because I think designing without any knowledge of what you're trying to design for is always a bad decision. So we're gonna say this is for something that's it's low poly, right? So that means it needs to be simple. It can't be super realistic or texture-based, right? It needs to be simplified. And I'm also going to say this is an enemy in the game that we're making. Enemy. So that means aggressive. Right? Can't look friendly. Can't look nice. I don't want players to walk up to it and be like, oh, I thought I could pet that. And it attacked me. I'm so angry. You don't want that to happen. And the next thing is that I want it to be recognizable. Let's say we really want the player to tell that it's a mix of these two creatures. Right. So this is a pretty useful list. I'm going to keep this up. And when I'm designing for myself, I always keep notes like this up on my screen. Just so that I can... Whoops. Just so that I can see them. So I'm going to go ahead and merge these layers together. Alright. So we have the references set up. So what I'm going to kind of look at here is I'm just going to reiterate some of these notes from before. So we have this kind of aggressive posture, right? Tilted ribcage, tilted scapula, tilted pelvis, forward momentum on this creature. And luckily for us, what's really fun about this is the dragonfly has a similar stance. Look at that. Look at those tilts, right? That's some nice tilts in here. And it also has some pretty jagged looking legs. So these look kind of aggressive already. I think these shapes are pretty triangular, pretty sharp, pretty easy to translate. So the way I like to sketch a lot of the time, let me try to get my brush to be good. If not, I'll just use a hard round brush. Is I usually start thinking about my center of mass, which is in a lot of creatures the rib cage. So let's say I want it to be kind of leaning forward. So I'm trying to maintain some of this momentum from the dragonfly here. And let's say I want to I'm going to make it a little smaller here. Let's say I want to get some of that tiger energy. So the tigers are very muscular. I'll describe some animal facts I know about these creatures as I'm working, so you know what I'm talking about. I don't expect you to know all these. Tigers are very muscular. They're one of the most muscular big cats. I think when I go in here, I'm going to try to make sure that I have this indication to myself at least, that there's a lot of muscle going on here. Maybe I'm going to define some of these, where these shoulder blades are. I kind of want it to go here. Right, and I kind of want to get, maybe, the dragonfly has a very pointy top of its head. So that's because the eyes are really big. So I might want to try to get some of that eye structure while maybe applying some of the sort of shape language of a tiger. Now this is a little more detailed than I would normally do a sketch like this. Normally I keep them very loose because I want them to be kind of more like gestural, because usually I'm checking the posture of the overall creature, but I'm kind of describing them a bit more than I normally would for you guys, so you can actually see what I'm trying to do a little bit clearer. I don't like how big this foot is. I also don't like how thin the arm is. Right? I want it to read as really muscular. And it's got this big, weird dragonfly eye. And I think I'm going to adjust it so that it doesn't have a cat nose. I think I want it to have that bug feel. So I'm going to kind of give it kind of like a bug face. Bug kind of tip of its nose, because I don't want it to look just like I morphed two creatures together and kind of glued their parts to each other. I want it to look like an integrated creature in this case. Now sometimes you're going to be asked to make designs that are chimeras, which is the term for creatures that are made up of multiple parts of different creatures merged together. And when you have to do designs like that, I do want it to theoretically in that case look like I just glued these different parts together. But in our case, I kind of want to kind of blend them a bit more subtly, I guess you could say. And maybe I want it to have this kind of like big tail, right? Something like this. I don't like how even that width is design-wise. Right? I want there to be a nice kind of balance of shapes to the best of my ability. I'm going to try to give it some variety. And I kind of like how segmented the body of the dragonfly is. So we're going to have this thing have some exoskeleton components. And I think I'm going to generally give it kind of an exoskeleton mixed with flesh. So this thing is not going to have fur, but I will give it the tiger's stripes later, and kind of go over that part of the thing I talked about where material and kind of the texture and finish can help sell something. maybe I'm gonna start compressing the rib cage, give it more kind of that curve to reinforce this curve back here. Right, so leg's a little too thick for an exoskeleton leg. And bugs have pretty skinny legs, so maybe for the back leg, right, instead of having this more fleshy approach, maybe I'll try having a more kind of buggy kind of thing. Or maybe there's these tiny little feet. Right. And then it has these wings, right? So maybe I wanted to have these wings kind of attached. And it looks like I've moved the drawing a little too far up to get that across. But the wings are pretty big. For now, I'm just going to indicate them. Right, and this is a side view, so I'm not gonna theoretically draw through and draw all the wings on the other side and stuff for now, because I personally think that for this drawing, that would obscure some of our gesture we have, and I want that to be clear in my sketch, so that I know what I kind of was drawing here, what I was thinking, what the structure was. I think I kind of like having that tiger fry. I think that's kind of fun. I don't know if I love how its neck is attached. I think it could be a bit more bulky, because there's this weird kind of bulbous feel to the joint up here for a dragonfly, so I think it had too much flesh. It was a little too fleshy looking, a little too soft, and we kind of want this to read as kind of being exoskeleton-y shape-wise. And then I would, in this case, because I'm kind of, again, this isn't how I would normally necessarily sketch it, but I'm gonna kind of start adding on some of the stripes, just to show what I'm thinking in my mind in terms of the mark making, or the decoration that's gonna go on this creature. Maybe they have tiger stripes that kind of fizzle out as you go down the limbs. And then, maybe on the tail, to really have it reading as a tiger, we'll kind of have these big, thicker stripes. Maybe we'll even have black tips on the wings to help it feel more integrated. This eyeball is going to be dark. Maybe there's some stripes in the eye, like some striations, mimicking the face kind of stripes, and maybe the lip is kind of dark, like a tiger. This is kind of, generally speaking, how I'd kind of go about approaching this. So you can kind of see that there's a lot of things that I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the structure. I'm thinking about kind of combining the different things that I talked about that were important on my list. It also has this kind of forward feeling to the gesture, right? It's kind of pushing towards more so the exaggerated feel of the dragonfly, but you'll note that the dragonfly has a shape kind of like this, and the tiger has a shape kind of more so like this, with the tail kind of pushing that gesture silhouette. You'll see that a lot with cats. The tail is actually a really important part of their gesture. If you draw a cat without a tail, it'll look very strange. So I'm trying to think about how this could kind of flick up a little bit in that kind of very feline way, where the tip of their tail tips up, versus a dog where the whole tail will kind of tip up and wag as like a whole unit. Cats tend to just kind of flick around the tip of their tail. So I'm thinking a little bit about that as well when I'm approaching this design. And then of course, if I say, okay, I show this to, whoever I'm designing this for, me, my art director, and they're like, yeah, that's pretty good, but I think you should make, I want the torso to be bigger. I want it to feel a bit heavier. And I'll say, okay, and a lot of the time, you can save time by just drawing over your same sketch, especially if they didn't hate everything about it. Or at the very least, you can use it as an anatomical base, right? Because I've got these pivots, and I'll actually draw them out very clearly for you guys here, so you can see what I'm talking about in action. Right, thinking about their gesture, and you got the spine, so you got the head, got the spine. Right, so we've got this kind of this very cat-like kind of curve to the body and stuff. So this is what I'm sort of thinking about as I'm drawing the gesture. I'm thinking about these pivots, right? The limbs. I'm thinking about the spine, and then I'm thinking about the head and how I can lead to the head. Because I think on creatures that have a head, it's a focal point. So you want it to kind of align with your gesture and be kind of clear what's going on. And even the wings, trying to align with my gesture so it has this kind of movement that it's splaying out, and yet despite all these kind of curves pushing out, I'm also having the weight of the creature, the physical weight pushing forward, right, onto these front limbs. Right, these front limbs are much less relaxed than the hind limbs, right? They're holding a lot of this body's weight. The back legs are carrying the tail's weight, but all of this kind of center of mass is on those front limbs. So that's what I'm thinking about a little bit with this creature. Very similar to kind of this tiger, right? Where there's a lot of the weight on this rib cage right here. He's got a big rib cage, lots of muscle right here, and a lot of that weight is sitting right here. The center of gravity is a little closer to the front, right? So these front legs are taking more weight. And so I'm thinking, okay, my art director said I need to make the front bigger. So how can I visually get that across in a shape? Maybe he also wants the eyes to be a bit bigger too, right? I don't really like that cut. Maybe something like this. Right, so you can see that this is kind of using gesture and shape language that we talked about before. This is a little more boxy, right? So maybe this is a little too boxy. Maybe I need it to be a little pointier. So I'm going to maybe adjust the head to kind of complement this curve. Right, so now I've got something even narrower, right? And then I'd start going off my sketch based off of this new gesture, if that makes sense. I'm adding mass to a different place, adjusting it, but I'm still trying to maintain the weight and the stuff that I liked about the earlier version. And if I drew some versions for you that were more boxy or more round, I think you'd be able to very clearly see that it's a bit less aggressive looking, right? Because you know now that this gesture is pretty important. Where this weight is pretty important. I don't know if you knew it before, but you probably hopefully know it now. So hopefully that explanation makes sense. I can do more if it doesn't make sense, and try drawing some other things to show you if you need comparison. But that's kind of how I'd approach it. On finding gesture. Oh, sorry, I'll read the question out. Can you give a quick example on finding gesture or some tip? Yeah, I can do that. No. No worries. In the videos section, so when talking about videos, that's gonna help you see how a creature moves. And doing gesture drawings from real life are going to help you find the gestures of creatures and how they naturally stand. I think the thing that I'm noting about the tilt of the rib cage, the tilt of the pelvis, and the tilt of the kind of the scapula in the front that I've mentioned a few times, the reason I keep mentioning that is because that's going to be kind of a really helpful thing to look for when defining the gesture of a creature. And if you have a creature like a dragonfly that doesn't have these features, looking for similar structures, right? Visually similar structures. Yeah. It's similar to a human. If you've ever done human anatomy figure drawing, I'm sure a lot of you, if you've ever gone over like Proco, a lot of these generic kind of figure drawing construction methods, a lot of the time, the things that they prioritize are the rib cage and the tilt of it, and then the pelvis, right? And the head, right? And the spine that kind of goes through those. And so that's going to apply as well to your creatures. Those being, because those were a lot of mass is based, and it's also, those are big rotational pivot points of the body, right? There's a lot of pivots in there of where the limbs go, and the kind of the mass and the weight of the body is, right? Like you're a human, a lot of your mass is in your torso, right? So that's kind of where your center of mass is. So your center of mass tends to be around your rib cage. If it's not, that's a little strange, but there are some creatures that are kind of like that, but they look kind of odd. Like bugs, insects are going to be something close to that, right? They don't have a rib cage, so the mass can really be anywhere on the body as long as it's balanced enough that the creature can move and fly. So if you're looking for gesture in something, that's kind of what I'd say is practice doing some gestures and looking for these key components of the structure. I also work in a very gestural way. So this might not be super clear or applicable for everyone, especially if you don't have a natural sense of gesture. You might kind of ask yourself while you're working or trying to replicate this process, how do I actually do this? This doesn't make sense. And I think thinking about function and movement is going to be your key. How is this? Are you recording the functionality of the creature in your gesture drawing, right? Are you clearly showing me how the limbs are moving and how the body's moving in your drawing? That's another way to think about gesture, is to think about it as how structure applies, how it is in action. And that can really help you out if you're not understanding this kind of loosey-goosey explanation a lot of people have for gesture, where it's like the flow of the drawing. Like, yeah, I know the drawing's flowing, but like, what defines that, right? And that depends on the teacher, but I think you can also think of it as structure and function and in application, in motion. And that will help you, thinking about where those pivot points are, thinking about what kind of angles you're talking about. That should get you most of the way. Hopefully. If you're still confused about it, I think just doing a lot of gesture drawings of creatures after that and humans after that will help you out. You will figure it out yourself. I'm 100% sure. I've never met anyone who didn't eventually get it, because trust me, it took me a while to get it too. And I will ask for any last questions before I finish up. Or like if there's any creatures you want me to cover or things like that. Clarification on any subjects, etc., etc. And I'll also drink water while you guys write that if you want. Sweet. It sounds like you guys are good. Nice. Just an hour and a half of me talking. Don't even worry about it. Yeah, no worries. I'm really glad people could attend. And if you missed anything, I will be posting up a link to the video so that you can watch it after the fact, because a few people who couldn't come requested that I record it. So you will be able to reference this. Feel free to look at it. Yeah, no worries. The first 40 minutes or so are very kind of much in-depth lecture from me. If you want to rewatch any of it, I think the first 40 minutes is the most important. But hopefully what I said throughout the whole thing was relatively useful. And not just kind of meandering around. I tried to keep stuff kind of relevant and on topic. But I'll say, for the end of the recording, thanks for watching / listening to this and attending if you were here live. And I hope that you can design creatures and have a lot of fun doing it, because it's great.